Widowed millionaire struggles to raise daughters until one girl asks, "Can she be our new mom?" Before the story begins, let's make this personal. What brought you here today? A recommendation, curiosity, or maybe just the universe guiding you? The silence in the penthouse was deafening, broken only by the soft whimpering of 3-month-old Hope in her crib. Alexander Rhodes stood at the floor-to-ceiling windows of his Manhattan apartment, watching the city move 30 floors below while his world remained frozen in time. The morning light cast harsh shadows across his face, revealing the exhaustion that had become his constant companion since that devastating night in March when everything changed forever. His reflection in the glass showed a man who had aged years in just 8 months. The confident CEO who once commanded boardrooms and closed billion-dollar deals was gone, replaced by someone hollow-eyed and broken. The expensive Italian suit hung loose on his frame. He had lost weight, unable to find pleasure in food or anything else that had once brought him joy. Everything tasted like ash, felt like obligation, existed only for the sake of the 2 small lives that depended on him. "Daddy, Hope is crying again," came the small voice behind him. Ellie, his 5-year-old daughter, stood in the doorway wearing her favorite pink pajamas, her blonde hair tousled from sleep. Those blue eyes, so much like her mother's, looked at him with a mixture of concern and the kind of wisdom that children shouldn't possess at such a young age. She had grown quiet since Victoria's death, watchful, as if she were constantly monitoring his emotional state and adjusting her own behavior accordingly. Alexander turned from the window, forcing a smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. "I know, sweetheart. Daddy's going to take care of her." He moved to the nursery, his feet heavy on the polished hardwood floors that Victoria had carefully selected when they first bought this place. Everything in this apartment held memories. The artwork she had chosen, the furniture they had picked out together, the piano where she used to play Chopin in the evenings while he worked late. The nursery was a shrine to Victoria's dreams. She had spent months planning every detail. The soft yellow walls, because they wanted to be surprised by the baby's gender. The handcrafted mobile with tiny stars and moons that she said would help their child learn to reach for dreams. The rocking chair where she had planned to spend countless hours nursing and singing lullabies. Now it felt like a monument to everything that had been stolen from them. He lifted Hope from her crib with practiced motions that still felt foreign and terrifying. 3 months of this routine, and he still felt like he was failing at every turn. Every cry felt like an accusation, every moment of fussiness like evidence of his inadequacy. Victoria would have known instinctively what Hope needed. She would have had that magical mother's intuition that made everything look effortless. Instead, Alexander was left stumbling through parenthood alone, a billionaire who could buy anything in the world except the one thing his daughters needed most: their mother. "Is she hungry?" Ellie climbed onto the rocking chair beside him, her small hand gently patting Hope's back with the careful tenderness of a child who had grown up too fast. The sight made Alexander's chest tighten with a mixture of pride and heartbreak. At 5 years old, Ellie was already trying to mother her baby sister, filling a role she was too young to understand, but mature enough to attempt. "Probably," he murmured, preparing the bottle with one hand while supporting Hope with the other. The movements were becoming more natural, but the weight of responsibility never got lighter. Every decision felt monumental, every mistake potentially catastrophic. What if he wasn't feeding her enough? What if he was feeding her too much? What if the formula wasn't the right temperature or the right brand? Or what if Hope needed something he couldn't provide? The pediatrician kept assuring him that he was doing fine, that Hope was healthy and developing normally, but Alexander couldn't shake the feeling that he was failing both his daughters every single day. Ellie needed attention, needed someone to help her process her own grief, needed a parent who wasn't drowning in his own pain. Hope needed consistency, needed bonding, needed all the things that came naturally to mothers and felt impossibly complex to fathers who were learning everything from scratch. As Hope settled into feeding, Alexander caught sight of his reflection in the nursery mirror. The man staring back looked nothing like the person he used to be. This man's eyes were hollow, his shoulders permanently hunched under an invisible burden, his expensive clothes wrinkled from another sleepless night spent pacing the halls, trying to exhaust himself enough to fall asleep without dreaming of Victoria. "Daddy, are you sad again?" Ellie's question cut through his thoughts like a knife. She had this uncanny ability to see straight through his attempts at normalcy, to the grief he tried so hard to hide from her. Children were like emotional barometers, picking up on every shift in mood, every crack in the facade adults tried to maintain. "Just tired, baby girl." It was partially true. Partially. The exhaustion was bone deep, the kind that sleep couldn't cure because it came from the soul rather than the body. But it was nothing compared to the ache that had taken up permanent residence in his chest. Every morning he woke up reaching for Victoria. Every night he fell asleep to the memory of her laugh echoing through rooms that now felt like a mausoleum. The penthouse that had once been filled with Victoria's warmth, her paintings scattered throughout, fresh flowers in every room, the sound of classical music drifting from her piano, the scent of whatever experimental recipe she was trying in the kitchen, now felt like a monument to loss. He kept everything exactly as she left it, unable to bear the thought of erasing any trace of the woman who had been his entire world. Her coffee mug still sat in the kitchen sink, unwashed. Her book lay open on the nightstand to the page she would never finish. Her maternity clothes hung in the closet like ghosts of the future they would never have. "Mrs. Patterson says we're going to have lunch in the park today," Ellie announced, referring to the nanny who had become their lifeline. Margaret Patterson was a godsend. 65 years old, with silver hair and infinite patience, she had raised 3 children of her own and helped dozens of families through difficult transitions. She was the one who made sure Ellie ate vegetables and brushed her teeth, who knew all the words to the lullabies that made Hope stop crying, who kept the household running while Alexander tried to hold himself together enough to be the father his daughters deserved. She says fresh air will make us feel better. Fresh air will... The way Ellie said it, with such hopeful determination, made Alexander realize how much his 5-year-old daughter was trying to take care of him. She had become hyper-aware of his moods, constantly trying to cheer him up, to be the perfect daughter who never caused problems or made demands. It wasn't fair to her, this role reversal where the child felt responsible for the parent's emotional well-being. "That sounds perfect, sweetheart." He meant it. Maybe getting out of this beautiful prison would help, even if only for a few hours. Maybe being around other families wouldn't feel like torture today. Maybe he could pretend, for Ellie's sake, that they weren't completely broken. The penthouse had become suffocating, every room filled with memories that felt both precious and painful. Victoria's presence was everywhere and nowhere, a constant reminder of what they had lost and what they would never have again. But as he looked down at Hope, sleeping peacefully in his arms after finishing her bottle, Alexander couldn't shake the feeling that he was drowning. The weight of raising 2 daughters alone, of being everything they needed when he felt like nothing inside, was crushing him slowly. He had built an empire, amassed a fortune that could last generations, commanded respect from world leaders and business moguls. But none of it mattered when he couldn't bring back the one person who made their house a home. The intercom buzzed, announcing Mrs. Patterson's arrival. Soon they would venture out into a world full of complete families, happy couples, mothers pushing strollers with ease and confidence that he envied more than any fortune. Alexander steeled himself for another day of pretending that the sight of other people's happiness didn't feel like salt in an open wound. Another day of smiling when people told him how strong he was being, how well he was handling everything, when inside he felt like he was falling apart one breath at a time. What he didn't know was that this particular day would change everything, that in Central Park, under the autumn sun, his carefully constructed walls would begin to crack in ways he never expected. And it would all start with a simple, innocent question from the one person who still believed in magic and second chances, who saw the world not as it was, but as it could be. Central Park buzzed with the energy of a perfect October afternoon. Families spread blankets on the grass. Children chased each other around towering oak trees painted in autumn gold, and couples walked hand in hand along winding paths lined with benches where elderly people fed pigeons and read newspapers in the dappled sunlight. For most people, it was an idyllic scene straight out of a postcard. For Alexander Rhodes, it felt like walking through a minefield of memories and missed opportunities. He pushed Hope's expensive stroller, the kind Victoria had researched for months, reading reviews and comparing safety ratings until she found the perfect one, while Ellie skipped ahead, her small backpack bouncing with each enthusiastic step. The backpack was new, purchased by Mrs. Patterson, because Ellie had insisted she needed somewhere to carry important things, like the smooth stones she collected and the drawings she made for Hope. It was pink, with little flowers, exactly the kind of thing Victoria would have picked out if she had been there to take Ellie shopping for her first real backpack. Mrs. Patterson, their grey-haired nanny who had become more family than employee, walked beside him with the kind of patient understanding that only came from decades of caring for children and the families who loved them. She had worked for Alexander's family for only 4 months, but she had become indispensable, not just for her practical skills, but for her uncanny ability to know when to speak and when to simply be present in the comfortable silence that grief sometimes required. "Mr. Rhodes, you need to eat something," she said gently, unpacking their picnic lunch on a checkered blanket that she had brought from her own home because she knew Alexander wouldn't think to buy such a thing. "You're getting too thin. Miss Ellie notices these things, you know. Children see everything, even when we think we're hiding it from them." Alexander wanted to tell her that food tasted like cardboard, that nothing had flavor anymore, that even his favorite meals reminded him of romantic dinners with Victoria at the little Italian place where they had their first date, or the elaborate brunches she used to make on Sunday mornings when they would spend hours reading the paper and planning their week together. Instead, he simply nodded and accepted the sandwich she offered, taking mechanical bites while watching Ellie explore the playground equipment with cautious curiosity. Ellie had always been careful, thoughtful, the kind of child who observed before she acted. But since Victoria's death, that caution had intensified into something that worried Alexander. She was afraid to stray too far from him, afraid to laugh too loudly, afraid to ask for things she wanted because she seemed to sense that her father was barely holding on, and any additional pressure might cause him to shatter completely. It wasn't fair for a 5-year-old to carry that kind of emotional burden, but Alexander didn't know how to fix it when he could barely manage his own pain. "Look, Daddy, that lady is reading to children." Ellie's excited voice drew his attention to a small crowd gathered around a park bench about 50 feet away. A woman sat there, surrounded by a semicircle of fascinated kids ranging in age from maybe 3 to 8, holding an illustrated book about dragons and princesses. Even from a distance, Alexander could see the animated way she moved her hands, bringing the story to life with gestures and expressions that had the children completely captivated. The woman was beautiful in an understated way that reminded him painfully of Victoria, not because they looked alike, but because of the natural grace in her movements, the unconscious elegance that came from someone who was completely comfortable in her own skin. She had shoulder-length chestnut hair that caught the sunlight and threw it back in subtle highlights, and she was wearing a simple cream sweater and dark jeans that suggested elegance without trying too hard. But it was her smile that stopped Alexander cold, made him forget to breathe for just a moment, for it was genuine, warm, full of joy and life, the kind of smile Victoria used to have when she was truly happy, when she was doing something that fed her soul. "Can I go listen, Daddy? Please?" Ellie's eyes were bright with an excitement he hadn't seen in months, maybe not since before Victoria got sick during the pregnancy, before everything became about hospital visits and worried conversations that stopped abruptly when Ellie walked into the room. The longing in his daughter's voice was almost painful to hear. When had she last been around someone who radiated the kind of warmth and joy that drew children like flowers turning toward the sun? Before he could answer, she was already moving toward the group, drawn by the woman's expressive voice and the magic of storytelling that had always been one of Ellie's favorite things. Victoria had been an amazing storyteller, weaving elaborate tales about brave princesses and magical creatures, often incorporating Ellie herself as the heroine of adventures that taught gentle lessons about kindness and courage and believing in yourself. Alexander found himself following, pushing the stroller closer until he could hear the woman's voice clearly. She was telling the story of a brave princess who had to save her kingdom, but she wasn't just reading from the book. She was performing, giving each character a unique voice, making sound effects for the dragon's roar and the clash of swords, gasping dramatically at plot twists that had the children on the edges of their cross-legged positions, hanging on every word. And so Princess Ilara discovered that sometimes the greatest strength comes not from fighting the dragon, but from understanding why the dragon was angry in the first place. The woman concluded, closing the book with a flourish that made several children applaud. Because you see, the dragon wasn't evil. He was just lonely and scared, protecting the only home he had ever known. And when Princess Ilara showed him kindness instead of meeting his anger with more anger, they became the most unlikely friends in the entire kingdom. The story hit Alexander harder than it should have. There was something about the message, about understanding pain instead of fighting it, about finding connection in the most unexpected places, that resonated with his own struggle to make sense of a world that had suddenly become incomprehensible. Maybe that was what grief was, a dragon guarding the treasures of memory, angry and protective and frightening to anyone who tried to approach. As the story circle dissolved, children returning to their parents with excited chatter about dragons and princesses, Ellie lingered near the bench. The woman noticed her hesitation and crouched down to Ellie's eye level with the natural ease of someone who genuinely loved children, who understood that they deserved to be met where they were, rather than forced to stretch up to adult expectations. "Did you like the story, sweetheart?" Her voice was soft, kind, with just a hint of a southern accent that made her words sound like music. There was something immediately trustworthy about her, something that made Alexander understand why Ellie had been drawn to her so quickly. "I loved it," Ellie whispered, suddenly shy in the way children sometimes became when faced with kind adults who paid attention to them. "My mommy used to read me stories like that. She made up voices for all the characters too, and she would let me help decide what happened next." The words hit Alexander like a physical blow, knocking the breath out of his lungs. Ellie rarely mentioned Victoria anymore, as if she had sensed that talking about her mother made her father's sadness worse, made the careful balance they had found more precarious. But here, with this stranger who radiated warmth and safety, she was opening up in a way she hadn't in months. The woman's expression grew gentle, understanding, touched with the kind of compassion that came from someone who had experienced loss herself. "Your mommy sounds like she was very special. What was your favorite story that she read to you?" "The one about the little girl who could talk to stars," Ellie said, her voice growing stronger as she warmed to the subject. "Mommy said that even when we can't see someone anymore, they're still watching over us like stars in the sky. And sometimes, if we're very quiet and very still, we can hear them whispering messages of love on the wind." Alexander felt his throat tighten with unshed tears. That had been one of Victoria's favorite bedtime stories, something she had made up herself during her pregnancy with Ellie, spinning elaborate tales about a little girl who went on adventures with her star friends and learned important lessons about love and loss and the continuity of connection across impossible distances. He hadn't heard those words since the funeral, when Ellie had stood graveside, clutching her stuffed rabbit and whispering about Mommy becoming a star, asking if stars could see through clouds and if they got lonely up there all by themselves. "That's a beautiful story," the woman said, and Alexander could hear genuine emotion in her voice, not the careful sympathy that most people offered when they learned about their loss. "And your mommy was absolutely right. Love doesn't end when someone goes away. It just changes form, like water becoming steam or ice becoming water again. It's still there, just different." It was then that Ellie turned toward Alexander, beckoning him over with small, urgent gestures that brooked no argument. She had that determined look on her face that he had learned to recognize, the same expression Victoria used to get when she had made up her mind about something and wouldn't be swayed by logic or reason or gentle persuasion. He approached reluctantly, feeling exposed and raw after overhearing the conversation about Victoria, after watching his daughter open up to a stranger in ways she hadn't been able to with him. "Daddy, this is—" Ellie paused, realizing she didn't know the woman's name, her small brow furrowing with the seriousness of a child who took proper introductions very seriously. "Dr. Sarah Chen," the woman said, standing gracefully and extending her hand toward Alexander. Her handshake was firm, professional, but her eyes held the same warmth she had shown Ellie, along with something else, a recognition, perhaps, of the pain that clung to him like cologne. "I'm a child psychologist, and I volunteer here on weekends reading to kids. Your daughter is absolutely delightful. She has wonderful insights about stories and characters." "Alexander Rhodes," he managed, his voice rougher than intended, rusty from disuse in social situations. "And thank you. She doesn't open up to strangers very often anymore." The words felt inadequate, a vast understatement of how carefully Ellie had been guarding herself, how she had become watchful and cautious in ways that broke his heart. Dr. Chen's expression grew understanding, and Alexander realized she could probably read the grief written across his face like an open book. Child psychologists, he supposed, were trained to recognize the signs of trauma and loss, to spot the telltale indicators of families struggling to cope with life-altering changes. "Loss changes children," she said quietly, her voice carrying the weight of professional knowledge tempered by personal experience. "But so does love." She's clearly surrounded by both. The observation was so accurate, so perfectly capturing the contradiction of their current existence, drowning in grief while swimming in love, overwhelmed by loss while blessed with what remained, that Alexander felt something shift inside his chest. Not breaking, but opening, like the first thaw after a brutal winter that had seemed like it would never end. For a moment, they stood in comfortable silence, watching as Ellie bent down to peer into Hope's stroller, making silly faces at her baby sister and whispering secrets in the nonsense language that seemed to make Hope's eyes focus and track movement. The scene was so normal, so beautifully ordinary, that Alexander felt a pang of something he hadn't experienced in months. Not happiness, exactly, but a momentary absence of crushing sadness, a brief respite from the weight that had settled on his shoulders like a lead blanket. "Daddy," Ellie said suddenly, her voice carrying that particular tone that meant she was about to say something important, something that had been percolating in her 5-year-old mind and was now ready to be shared with the world. She looked between Alexander and Dr. Chen, her young brain obviously working through something significant, processing information in ways that adults had forgotten how to do. Alexander waited, sensing that whatever came next would be one of those moments that divided life into before and after. He had learned to recognize these pivotal seconds. The phone call that told him Victoria was in labor 3 weeks early, the doctor's expression when he emerged from the delivery room, the first time Hope had smiled at him, and he realized that joy and grief could coexist in the same heart. He was right about the importance of this moment, though he couldn't have imagined just how prophetic Ellie's next words would prove to be. "Can she be our new mommy?" The words hit the park like a thunderclap, freezing everything in a moment of stunned silence. Alexander felt the blood drain from his face as every eye in their vicinity turned toward them. Other parents, joggers who had slowed their pace, even the hot dog vendor who had been calling out his wares. Dr. Sarah Chen's cheeks flushed crimson, her mouth opening and closing without sound, like a fish pulled suddenly from water. Even the birds seemed to stop singing, as if the entire world was holding its breath to see how the adults would handle this moment of pure, innocent honesty. Ellie stood between them, completely oblivious to the bombshell she had just dropped, her innocent blue eyes looking from her father to Dr. Chen, with the hopeful expectation of a child who believed that adults could fix anything, that the world was fundamentally logical and fair and responsive to reasonable requests. She was still holding one of the autumn leaves she had collected, twirling it between her small fingers as she waited for an answer to what seemed, from her perspective, like a perfectly sensible question. "Ellie, sweetheart." Alexander's voice came out as barely a whisper, his throat closing around the words like he was drowning in air. His hands were shaking as he gripped the stroller handle, knuckles white with tension, fighting the urge to run away from this moment, from this public display of their private pain, from the well-meaning stranger who had inadvertently become the catalyst for his daughter's desperate wish for wholeness. "I'm so sorry, Doctor," Chen said quickly, her professional composure cracking to reveal the very human woman underneath. "Children sometimes, they process loss differently. I never intended." She was backing away slightly, clearly uncomfortable with being thrust into such an intimate family moment, recognizing that she had become an unwitting participant in something far more complex and painful than a simple story time in the park. But Ellie wasn't finished. With the determined logic that only a 5-year-old could possess, the kind of reasoning that cut straight through adult complications to the heart of what mattered, she continued her case. "She reads stories like Mommy did, and she has kind eyes like Mommy had, and she made me smile, and I haven't smiled at a stranger since." She paused, her small brow furrowing as she tried to work through the timeline in her head to pinpoint exactly when everything had changed. "Since Mommy went to heaven," Alexander finished softly, his heart breaking all over again as he knelt down beside his daughter, taking her small hands in his much larger ones. The contrast was stark. His hands bore the calluses of grief, the invisible weight of responsibility, while hers were still soft with childhood innocence, unmarked by the kind of losses that aged people from the inside out. "Baby girl, Dr. Chen is a very nice lady, but she has her own life, her own family." The words felt hollow, even as he spoke them, insufficient to explain the complexity of adult relationships, the way hearts worked, the difference between needing something and being able to have it. "Do you?" Ellie asked, turning to Dr. Chen with the direct honesty of childhood, the kind of blunt question that adults had been trained out of asking. "Do you have a little girl like me, or a baby like Hope?" Dr. Chen's expression grew complicated, shadows passing across her features like clouds moving over the sun. There was something there, some story that she wasn't ready to tell, some pain that matched their own in ways that weren't immediately obvious. "No, sweetie, I don't have children of my own." She paused, seeming to choose her words with the careful precision of someone who had learned that honesty and truth weren't always the same thing. "But I work with lots of children who are dealing with difficult situations. That's my job, helping families find their way through hard times." Alexander studied her face, recognizing something in her carefully controlled expression that resonated with his own experience. There was pain there, buried deep, but not quite hidden. The kind of controlled grief that came from professional necessity, from needing to be strong for others when your own heart was cracked. Everyone had their losses, their private griefs, their secret wishes for things that could never be, and he found himself wondering what shadows lived behind her professional smile, what dreams she had given up or lost along the way. "See, Daddy, she could take care of us." Ellie's voice rose with excitement, as if she had solved the world's most complex equation with the simple arithmetic of need plus availability equals solution. And you wouldn't be sad anymore, and Hope would have someone to sing her lullabies the way Mommy used to, and I could have someone to braid my hair and help me pick out dresses for special occasions. Each word was another knife to Alexander's already wounded heart, but also a revelation about how much his 5-year-old daughter had been observing, cataloguing, trying to fix. The casual way Ellie listed all the things they had lost, all the ways their family was broken, made him realize that she understood their situation far better than he had given her credit for. She wasn't just missing her mother. She was missing all the specific ways Victoria had made their family complete, all the small daily acts of love that added up to the architecture of home. 3 weeks had passed since that fateful afternoon in Central Park, and Alexander found himself doing something he hadn't done in 8 months, looking forward to something. Sarah had become a fixture in their lives, not in the way Ellie had initially hoped, but as something equally precious. A friend who understood the weight of loss without trying to fix it. Their coffee meetings had evolved into regular occurrences, sometimes just the two of them during Hope's nap times, sometimes family gatherings where Sarah would read stories or help Ellie with art projects that transformed their sterile penthouse into something that felt almost like a home again. She had a gift for being present without being intrusive, for offering support without making Alexander feel like a charity case. She's getting stronger, Sarah observed, watching as Alexander fed Hope her afternoon bottle. They were sitting in the penthouse living room, autumn sunlight streaming through the massive windows. Ellie was at her small art table nearby, working on a drawing with focused concentration. "The pediatrician says she's right on track," Alexander replied, marveling at how natural this felt. Having another adult to share these small parental observations with, someone who cared about Hope's development from genuine affection. "She's starting to track movements better, and yesterday I swear she tried to grab my finger." Sarah smiled, the kind of warm expression that had become as familiar to Alexander as his own reflection. Over the past 3 weeks, he had memorized the way her eyes crinkled when she laughed, the subtle southern inflection that crept into her voice when she was relaxed. "Daddy, look!" Ellie held up her latest masterpiece, a crayon drawing of 4 stick figures standing in front of a house. "It's our family." Alexander's breath caught as he studied the drawing. There was a tall figure labeled Daddy, a smaller figure labeled Ellie, an even tinier figure that must be Hope, and a 4th figure with long brown hair labeled Sarah. "That's very nice, sweetheart," he managed, acutely aware of Sarah's stillness beside him. "But remember, Sarah is our friend, not—" "I know," Ellie said matter-of-factly, "but she feels like family. And Mommy said that family isn't just the people you're born with. It's the people who love you and take care of you and make you feel safe." The words hung in the air like a challenge. Because Ellie wasn't wrong, Sarah did feel like family in ways that terrified Alexander. She knew that Hope preferred her bottles slightly warm, that Ellie got cranky without a 3 o'clock snack, that Alexander took his coffee black, but would accept cream if that's all available. "Your mummy was very wise," Sarah said softly. And she was right. Love comes in many different forms. Alexander studied Sarah's profile, noting the tension around her eyes. Over the past 3 weeks, he had begun to recognize the signs of someone carrying their own heavy load of grief and secrets. She deflected personal questions with therapeutic skill, never spoke about her own family, and sometimes he caught her looking at Hope with an expression so profound and painful it took his breath away. "Sarah," he said impulsively, "would you like to stay for dinner tonight? Mrs. Patterson is making her famous lasagna and—" He paused, realizing he was about to cross a line they had been maintaining. "I mean, if you don't have other plans." For a moment, Sarah looked like she might refuse. Then Ellie looked up with hopeful eyes, and something in Sarah's expression crumbled. "I'd love to," she said quietly. "Thank you." Dinner was a revelation. For the first time since Victoria's death, Their dining room felt alive with conversation and laughter. Sarah told stories about her work, carefully anonymized tales of children she had helped, families she had guided through difficult transitions. "Do you help kids who miss their mommies?" Ellie asked over dessert. "Sometimes," Sarah replied carefully. "Everyone processes loss differently. Some children get angry, some get very quiet, some try to take care of everyone around them." She glanced meaningfully at Ellie. "And sometimes the bravest thing a child can do is ask for help when they need it." "I don't need help," Ellie said quickly. "I'm taking care of Daddy and Hope." Alexander felt his throat tighten. His 5-year-old daughter was shouldering more emotional responsibility than any child should carry. "You know what I think?" Sarah leaned forward, conspiratorially. "I think you're doing an amazing job taking care of your family. But even the strongest people need someone to take care of them sometimes. That's what makes us human. We're supposed to need each other." Later, after Ellie had been tucked into bed and Hope was settled for the night, Alexander and Sarah sat in the living room with wine, the city lights twinkling below them. The silence was comfortable, but charged with unspoken possibilities. "She's not wrong, you know," Sarah said eventually, "about needing people, about family being more than blood relations." Alexander studied her profile, noting the vulnerability in her posture. "Sarah, can I ask you something? And please, feel free not to answer if it's too personal." She nodded, though he could see her preparing defenses. "Do you have family, parents, siblings, anyone who—" He paused. "I just realize I know almost nothing about your life outside of the time you spend with us." Sarah was quiet for so long, Alexander thought she wouldn't answer. When she finally spoke, her voice was barely above a whisper. "I had a daughter once." The words hit the room like a physical presence. Her name was Emma. She would have been 7 now. Alexander felt his heart stop. The careful way Sarah had said "would have been" told him everything he needed to know. "Sarah, I'm so sorry. I had no idea." "No one does," she said, not looking at him. "I don't talk about her. It's been 3 years, and it's still too hard." She took a shaky sip of wine. "She was 4 when she died. Leukemia. We fought it for 2 years, but—" The silence stretched between them, filled with pain that had no adequate words. Alexander wanted to reach for her, but something in her posture warned him off. "Is that why you became a child psychologist?" he asked gently. Sarah nodded. "After Emma died, I couldn't stay in pediatric medicine anymore. Every sick child reminded me of her. I switched to psychology because I thought maybe I could help families cope with loss without feeling like I was reliving my own nightmare every day. And does it? Help, I mean. Sometimes. And sometimes it makes it worse, because I see so clearly what these families are losing." She finally looked at him, tears tracking down her cheeks. "But I keep doing it because maybe, if I can help enough families stay together, maybe Emma's death will mean something." Alexander moved closer on the sofa, not touching but close enough for support. "I think Emma would be incredibly proud of the woman her mother became. And I think she would love knowing that her mommy is helping other children find their way through the dark." Sarah broke then, sobbing with raw grief that had been controlled too long. Without thinking, Alexander pulled her into his arms, holding her as she cried for the daughter she would never see grow up. They stayed like that for a long time, 2 people who had been carrying unbearable weights alone, finally finding someone who understood the specific gravity of loss. When Sarah's tears finally subsided, she pulled back, embarrassed. "I'm sorry. I don't usually." "Don't apologize," Alexander said firmly. "Not for this. Not ever." She looked at him with wonder. "How do you do it? How do you wake up every day and keep going when everything inside feels broken?" "I think we do it the same way anyone survives anything impossible. One breath at a time, one day at a time, and we let the people who love us help carry the weight." He reached up to brush a tear from her cheek. "Is that what this is? Us helping each other carry the weight?" "I think," Alexander said, "it might be something even more than that. If we're brave enough to let it be." Sarah smiled through her tears, the first real smile that reached her eyes since he'd known her. "I'd like that. I'd like to be brave enough for something more. 2 months had passed since Sarah had shared the truth about Emma, and their relationship had deepened into something neither had expected. It wasn't desperate replacement or careful friendship, but something tentative and precious. Two broken people learning to trust each other with their damaged hearts. Alexander found himself looking forward to Sarah's visits with intensity that both thrilled and terrified him. She had become integral to their routine in ways that went beyond Ellie's obvious adoration or Hope's delighted gurgles. She was the person he called when Hope had her first fever, the one who helped Ellie work through nightmares about more people disappearing, the woman who sat with him on difficult evenings, offering presents instead of solutions. But it was more than support. For the first time since Victoria's death, Alexander was remembering what it felt like to be a man, not just a father. When Sarah smiled at him, when she touched his arm while talking, when he caught her watching him with expressions beyond friendship, he felt stirrings of desire he thought were buried forever. Ellie sensed the shift with uncanny perception. "Are you going to marry Sarah?" she asked one morning over breakfast. Alexander nearly choked on his coffee. "Ellie, sweetheart, we're not. Sarah is our friend." "But you like her like how you liked Mommy," Ellie said with devastating accuracy. "I can tell, because you smile with your eyes when she's here, and you haven't done that since before Hope was born." Mrs. Patterson made a small sound that might have been approval. She had been watching their developing relationship with knowing eyes. "It's complicated, baby girl," Alexander said. "Sometimes adults need time to figure out their feelings. Why? If you love someone and they love you back, why wouldn't you want to be together?" The simplicity of her logic was beautiful and heartbreaking, if only it were that easy. That evening, Sarah arrived for their regular Tuesday dinner, but there was something different, a nervous energy that Alexander recognized as the precursor to important conversations. "Can we talk?" she asked after Ellie was in bed. "There's something I need to tell you." Alexander felt his stomach drop. "Of course. What is it?" Sarah was quiet for a long moment, gathering courage. When she looked up, her expression was fear and determination mixed. "I haven't been entirely honest with you," she began, and Alexander felt the world shift. "About Emma, about my background, about why I was really in that park the day we met. Sarah, whatever it is." Please, let me finish," she interrupted, voice shaking. "Because if I don't say this now, I might never find the courage again, and you deserve to know the truth." Alexander nodded, though every instinct screamed at him to stop her. 3.5 years ago, I was working at Mount Sinai Hospital, Sarah began quietly. "I was a pediatric cardiologist then, specializing in high-risk pregnancies and newborn cardiac issues." Alexander felt something cold spread through his chest. Mount Sinai, the hospital where Victoria had been taken, where Hope was born, and Victoria had. "There was a case," Sarah continued, tears beginning. "A woman who came in with premature labor at 37 weeks. Everything seemed routine at first. The baby was healthy, no obvious complications. But during delivery, something went wrong. Alexander's vision blurred as implications hit him. He knew where this was going. The mother started bleeding, massive hemorrhaging that came suddenly. Postpartum hemorrhage, severe and unpredictable. We tried everything, surgery, transfusions, every protocol we had. The wineglass slipped from Alexander's fingers, shattering against marble, but he barely heard it over the roaring in his ears. "I was part of the team that tried to save her," Sarah whispered. "We worked for 40 minutes, tried everything. But she had given everything to bring her daughter into the world, and there was nothing left." "You were there," Alexander said, voice flat and strange. "You were there the night Victoria died." Sarah nodded, sobbing now. "I was the pediatric cardiologist on call. I was supposed to make sure the baby, that Hope, was okay after the traumatic delivery. I was in the room when your wife took her last breath." Alexander stood abruptly, pacing to the window, as if he could escape this conversation, this revelation. His hands shook, his breath coming in short gasps. "You knew," he said, voice hollow. "This whole time, you knew who I was, who Hope was, and you didn't say anything. You let me fall in love with you while hiding that you were there the night my world ended. Because I was afraid, Sarah said desperately. Because I've been carrying the guilt of not being able to save her for 3.5 years. Because seeing you and Ellie and Hope in that park felt like either the cruelest coincidence or some chance for redemption I didn't deserve. Redemption? Alexander's voice rose with anger. You think this is about redemption? You think getting close to my family, making my daughter love you, making me... He stopped, unable to finish. I know how this looks, Sarah said through tears. I know it seems like manipulation, but I swear, Alexander, I had no idea you would be in that park. When I realized who you were, I should have walked away, but I couldn't. Why? The question came out like a growl. Because I fell in love with your family, Sarah said simply. Because, for the first time since Emma died, I felt useful again, needed again. Because Hope looks at me like I'm wonderful, instead of the doctor who couldn't save her mother. Because you made me remember what it felt like to be alive. Alexander stared at her, mind reeling. Every conversation, every moment of connection, every time she had helped, all colored by this enormous secret. The night Victoria died, you were there. You saw what it did to me, to Ellie, and then you inserted yourself into our lives knowing what you knew. How could you do that? Because I thought maybe I could help, Sarah said quietly. Because I've been having nightmares about that night for 3 years, wondering if there was something else I could have done. When I saw you struggling, I thought maybe this was my chance to finally do something right for your family. By lying to us? By loving you, Sarah said simply. I know it was wrong to keep the truth from you, but I was terrified that if you knew, you'd never let me near your daughters. The silence that followed was deafening, filled with the sound of everything they had built crumbling. When Alexander finally spoke, his voice was quiet and deadly. I need you to leave. Alexander, please, I need you to leave, he repeated, not looking at her. Now, before I say something we'll both regret. He heard her gather her things, heard her footsteps, heard the door close. Only then did he collapse into the chair, burying his face in his hands as the full weight of betrayal crashed over him. The woman he was falling in love with had been there the night his world ended. She had watched his wife die and said nothing. How could he ever trust her again? Outside, Sarah sat in her car, sobbing with desperate grief. She had known this day would come, had hoped their connection would be strong enough to survive. She had been wrong. Now she had lost not just Alexander, but Ellie and Hope as well, the family that had given her life meaning again. 6 weeks had passed since Sarah left, and the penthouse felt like a tomb. Alexander moved through his days like a ghost, going through motions of parenthood while his heart remained frozen in betrayal. Ellie asked about Sarah constantly for 2 weeks, then gradually stopped when it became clear something terrible had happened. She began drawing darker pictures, storm clouds and broken trees instead of happy families. Nightmares returned, waking up crying for people who couldn't come. Even Hope seemed affected, becoming fussy and difficult to soothe, looking toward the door whenever someone knocked, brightening with expectation that would fade to disappointment when Sarah didn't appear. Mrs. Patterson finally confronted him one evening as he sat pretending to work. "Mr. Rhodes," she said, settling across from his desk with determined air, "I've watched you struggle through grief, but whatever happened with Dr. Chen is affecting the children, and that's where I draw the line." Alexander looked up, noting steel in her usually gentle voice. "Margaret, I appreciate your concern, but—" "No," she interrupted, something she'd never done. "Ellie has regressed months in emotional development. She's clingy, anxious, asking if I'm going to disappear too. Hope won't settle properly, and you look worse than after your wife died." The words hit like physical blows because they were true. What Dr. Chen did was wrong. Mrs. Patterson continued. "Keeping that secret was terrible, but cutting her out completely is hurting them more than her deception ever could. She was there the night Victoria died," Alexander said quietly. "Part of the medical team that couldn't save my wife, and she never told me." Mrs. Patterson processed this carefully. Did she know who you were when she first met you? Alexander hesitated, forced to confront what he'd been avoiding. If honest, Sarah's shock when Ellie asked about being their new mommy had seemed genuine. No, he admitted reluctantly. I don't think she did. Then her crime was falling in love with your family and being too afraid to risk losing you by telling the truth, Mrs. Patterson said simply. That doesn't excuse deception, but it makes her human rather than calculating. Before Alexander could respond, Ellie appeared clutching her rabbit, anxious expression too familiar over past weeks. Daddy, I can't sleep, she whispered. I keep having the dream where everyone goes away. Alexander scooped her up, heart cracking. What happens in the dream, baby girl? First, Mummy goes away to be a star, Ellie said against his chest. Then Sarah goes away because I asked her to be our new mommy, and that made you sad. Then you go away too, and Hope, and I'm all alone. Each word was a knife to his wounded heart. His daughter was carrying responsibility for their family's dissolution, believing her innocent question had caused Sarah to disappear. Sarah didn't go away because of anything you did, Alexander said, holding her tighter. Sometimes grown-ups have complicated problems that have nothing to do with little girls who want their families to be happy. But she's not coming back, is she? Ellie asked with too much understanding. Like Mommy's not coming back? Alexander felt something break open, not sharp grief, but slow dissolution of anger, making room for something more honest. I don't know, baby girl, he admitted. Would you want her to come back? Yes, Ellie said without hesitation. She made you smile for real, not pretend. And she looked at Hope, like Hope was wonderful instead of sad, because Hope reminds everyone Mommy's not here. The observation was devastating in accuracy. Sarah had loved Hope purely, without complicated grief most people carried when seeing the baby who had cost Victoria her life. That night, standing in Hope's nursery watching his daughter sleep, Alexander allowed himself to think about Sarah without immediate anger. He remembered how she'd looked at Hope that first day, with wonder rather than complicated grief. How naturally she'd comforted Ellie, how effortlessly she'd fit into their routines. The betrayal still hurt, but underneath, he was beginning to understand. Sarah had been carrying her own unbearable weight. The next morning, Alexander called Mount Sinai Hospital, claiming insurance research. What he learned changed everything. Dr. Sarah Chen had been one of the most respected pediatric cardiologists on the East Coast. The night Victoria died, she'd stayed 4 hours past her shift, working with specialists, trying every intervention to save a woman she'd never met. After Victoria's death, Sarah had taken extended leave. When she returned, colleagues noticed changes, less confidence, struggling with decisions that once came naturally. 6 months later, she left pediatric medicine entirely, but there was more. Sarah had attended Victoria's funeral, standing in back, watching a family grieve for someone she couldn't save. She'd seen Ellie whisper about stars, seen Alexander break down, carried those images when she changed careers to help families cope with loss. Armed with this understanding, Alexander found himself outside Sarah's apartment on a cold December afternoon, Hope in his arms, Ellie holding his hand. Sarah answered, looking like she'd aged years. When she saw them, her expression cycled through shock, hope, and controlled longing. "Alexander," she whispered, "what are you doing here?" "Sarah." Ellie broke free and launched herself at Sarah's legs. "I missed you so much." Sarah's composure crumbled as she knelt, gathering Ellie with fierce intensity. "Oh, sweetheart, I missed you too, more than you could know." Hope, recognizing Sarah's voice, began making happy sounds, reaching toward her. "Can we come in?" Alexander asked quietly. "We need to talk." In her apartment, they sat with Ellie curled against Sarah's side, Hope reaching constantly for her. "I know why you didn't tell me," Alexander said without preamble. "I spoke to the hospital, learned about what really happened that night. Everything you did to try to save Victoria." Sarah's face went pale. "Alexander, I can explain." "You don't need to," he interrupted gently. "I understand now why you couldn't tell me who you were. the guilt you've been carrying, feeling like you failed us. I get it. And I'm sorry it took 6 weeks to see past my hurt to understand yours." Sarah looked at him with disbelief. "You're not angry anymore?" "I'm still hurt," Alexander said honestly. "The deception stings, and it'll take time to fully trust again, but I'm not angry, because I understand you didn't keep quiet to manipulate us. You kept quiet because you were terrified of losing the only family that made you feel alive since Emma died." "I was so scared," Sarah whispered. "When I realized who you were, I should have walked away, but I couldn't. For the first time in 3 years, I felt useful, needed. And then Ellie asked if you could be our new mommy, and everything got complicated," Alexander said with understanding. Ellie looked between them seriously. "Are you crying because you're sad or happy?" Both, sweetheart," Sarah said, smoothing Ellie's hair. "Sad because I made mistakes that hurt people I love, but happy because you're here." "We are a family," Ellie said with 5-year-old certainty. "Maybe not like other people, but we love each other and take care of each other." Alexander felt tears as he listened to his daughter's simple wisdom. She's right. We are a family. Complicated, imperfect, but real. And real families forgive mistakes and figure out how to move forward. He reached for Sarah's hand, marveling at how right it felt. "I love you, Sarah, despite everything. I love you not because you're perfect, but because you're human and brave enough to try building something beautiful from broken pieces." Sarah looked at him with wonder. "I love you too. I love all of you. Being with your family taught me hearts can break and heal simultaneously." As afternoon's sun slanted through windows, Ellie settled between the adults who loved her most, and hope finally grabbed Sarah's finger with determination of someone not letting go. They had all been broken by loss, shaped by grief, changed by understanding that love always risked heartbreak. But they'd learned healing was possible, that families could be rebuilt, that second chances were gifts to treasure rather than fear. Sometimes the most beautiful families are built from broken pieces of ones you've lost, held together not by perfection, but by the fierce decision to choose love over fear, trust over safety, hope over the certainty that opening your heart will only lead to pain.